Okay, so I guess we can go ahead and get started. Um, Hello, everyone, and thank you again so much for joining us. It's so great to see so many people here and a lot of familiar names, even though I can't see familiar faces. My name is Frankie Concepcion, and I am this year's managing editor for Hayden's Ferry Review. Thank you so much for joining us for this fall's craft chat. So this craft chat features two contributors. There's Saba Keramati and Rebecca Martin. Both were featured in our web issue, Tiny Architectures, which was dreamed up by our previous web editor, Christina D'Antoni, and which was published last year. Christina is here joining us today, so let's give her like a little virtual round of applause. Um, Before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's four campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acamel, O'odham, Pima, and Peepash Maricopa Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. We know that a land acknowledgement without action is not sufficient, and we are making efforts towards equitable practices, starting with our free submissions for underrepresented writers and our inaugural Indigenous Poets Prize, which took place earlier this year. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please use the chat as a space to celebrate what you hear. Feel free to share moving lines or reflect on the poems or the conversation that you hear tonight. If you would like to ask a question for the discussion later in the evening, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we have our lovely associate editor, Isa Schulman, monitoring that. So we want to make sure that we're getting all of your questions and we're not missing anything. So now I'd like to introduce you to our amazing associate editor, Maya Chari. In addition to being a current third year fiction MFA here at Arizona State University, Maya has also served on the HFR editorial team for 3 years as part of our fiction, translation, and nonfiction genres. Tonight, she will join Rebecca and Saba in conversation on behalf of HFR, and later on, she'll be relaying your questions to our Craft Chat guests. Please join me in welcoming Maya. Yay!
Thank you so much, Frankie. We have two accomplished and talented poets who were kind enough to share their work and their time with us this evening. Rebecca Martin is the author of High Tech Invasions of the Flesh, released with Bottle Cap Press in 2022. They are a queer poet, educator, and roller skater from Ohio, whose work appears in Nimrod International Journal, Hayden's Ferry Review, Muzzle Magazine, Peach Mag, and others. They received an honorable mention in Small Orange's 2023 Emerging Woman Poet Honor and in the 2022 Gulf Coast Poetry Prize. They are a graduate of Oregon State University's MFA program, where they served as poetry editor for literary magazine 45th Parallel and as department steward for their graduate employee union. She currently lives and works in Pittsburgh. We also have Saba Keramati joining us tonight. Saba Keramati is a Chinese-Iranian writer from California. She is the author of Self Mythology, selected by Patricia Smith, and released by the University of Arkansas Press in 2024. A winner of the 92 New York Discovery Poetry Prize. Saba's work appears in AGNI, Adroit Journal, Poet Lore, The Margins, and other publications. She is the poetry editor at Sundog Lit. Please join me in welcoming to the virtual stage Rebecca and Saba.
Hello. Maya, would you like us to read now? Do you want us to wait a bit?
If you're ready, we that it would be amazing if you would start reading.
Okay, cool. I'll start reading now. I am going to also share my screen while I read, just like maybe a little extra, but this poem is pretty visual, and I think you'll see what I mean if you haven't seen it already. And I'll just share this is on the website, so you can look at it too if you'd like to read it on your end. And this poem is called Plot Holes. Beehives are a system. Hexagonal, prismatic cells hum inside a man-made structure, differentiated from nest. Interstate highways are a system. Calculated violence cut into rock face, into soft earth and pine needles. If I wanted to tell you a story about violence, it might be the man's fist directed away from the head of my friend, small crumbling in the basement office wall, a hug pressed against our shoulders, breath in our ear. If I wanted to tell you a story about making conversation, it might be a friend meeting another woman with familiar Greek letters on her sweatshirt. Were you in that sorority in college? My friend asks. Blank face response, then a row of teeth upturned. Oh, it's a Halloween costume. Ted Bundy. Fake bloodstains at the collar and sleeves. On the drive home with her boyfriend, my friend doesn't say a thing. Our set of planets is a system, each rotation measured until it wobbles far enough to be discarded. Documentary filmmaking is a system. A man says he thinks a woman deserves a name on her gravestone, at least. If I wanted to tell you a story about anomalies, it might be the time I got into a stranger's car and was seen again. Give me any urgency, and I'll press crumpled paper money into your hands, anything for a thank you and a flashing of teeth.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Would you mind saying a few words about how you felt that your poem connected to the tiny architectures theme?
Yeah, definitely. I think the kind of idea of like the poem as a room or like a really contained space felt pretty relevant to this poem, which kind of it started out as like three little kind of plot holes and then grew into being right like I think I have six or seven there now, but yeah, I think the spatial aspect of that felt really key, like even as I was revising too. So, and even like reading it, I don't know, that's not the authoritative way to read it. There's a lot of different ways that you could follow the arrows. That's just what was kind of calling to me this evening. But yeah.
Thank you. I can't wait to talk some more about your piece later. Now I would like to invite Saba to read her poem.
Hi. I will also share my screen so folks can read along if they would like. Um, this is Self-Portrait as a Bowl of Persimmons. It is true, all words are invented. I have names in 3 languages. What's the word for this? My mother brings home persimmons from the market. She names them, washes them gently so as not to bruise. My father opens the persimmons. He names them, reveals how they are somehow darker on the inside than the out. I eat persimmons, ruminating on poetry, turning the words of it over in my mouth with each chew, each bite, a new language. With the taste comes the remembering. So much, what are you? There are 2 kinds of persimmons. In English, they are the same. I define myself, a hybrid child, heart-shaped and ready. I celebrate the sweet flesh of myself, call myself, name myself, create a fortune of myself. I am looking for words, but why? The persimmons are right there.
Thank you so much, Saba. That was gorgeous. Would you mind saying a few words about how you see your pieces connecting to the tiny architectures theme?
Yeah, so when I saw the call for tiny architectures, I was so excited. One, because I love Hayden's Ferry review, and two, because I think a lot of my work deals with, even if not small objects, not as small as a persimmon, like small moments in time. So I think when I was thinking about tiny architectures and work that might fit in with that, there was a lot of consideration about what we consider, grand ideas about what poetry should be about: the ocean, the moon. We all use it, it's fine. But I think, well, something is happening in the chat that I'm going to ignore. But I think when we discuss sort of ideas of what's small, it's difficult to remember yourself as a subject that we write about, and that, I think, is a tiny architecture. I'm sorry, I don't know where I ended with my sentence because I was really distracted by the chat, but I hope that made sense.
I think it made sense, but I was also a little distracted by the chat. But I think this person has been removed, and we can continue our conversation. I'm very sorry that that happened.
That is nobody's fault, and thank you to Susan and Isa for navigating the behind the scenes stuff.
Okay, so now I have some more questions for both of you. In the audience, if you have any questions that you think of, please put them in the Q&A. And I will get them and I will ask them to our lovely readers. So the first question that I have is, to me, both of these pieces point at the limitations and frustrations of trying to express oneself through language, especially the English language, but also just language in general. And how do you think about the limitations of language and address them in your work?
I feel like it feels so much ruder to like unmute and start talking in Zoom than if you were in person. Okay, I'll start talking because I already am, but Saba, feel free to like interrupt me at any point. So I mean, I think this is such an interesting question, and I really love it too. I think we were talking a little about that before, like the show, just like these questions are so interesting and like really made me think more about. So this is a piece I wrote in graduate school, so a little over a year ago. And this project in particular is like really struggling with thinking about like true crime and surveillance and like the way that we write about violence and like trying not to beautify it, but also like having language for something that is hard to have language around. And so I think the kind of like fragmented nature of this, I was kind of like refusing to, I guess there's stanzas, right? You could argue that the plot holes are there are stanzas, but I didn't really put them like in a hierarchy with each other. Where they are in the page is kind of fluid, or where you want to begin or end can be fluid. And that was something that was exciting to me and like in the subject matter, because in the kind of experiences that it's gesturing at, right, it is really fragmented and there's not a really like clear linear narrative that I want to happen, at least in this piece.
Can I ask sorry, can I ask a small follow-up question? Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm sorry. We'll get the hang of it. It's okay.
How do you decide what order to read them in when you read it out loud?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I had to think about that because I was like, I actually don't know if I've read this out loud before. It's like not one that I always go to for readings or like anything like that, because it's such a visual poem and I don't always have the capability to like share the screen like I did. But honestly, today I just kind of read through it in a couple of different ways and thought about where I wanted to start and where I wanted to end. And so that's how I chose today, but I feel like on a different day I might choose differently. So
Saba, what were you saying before I rudely cut you off?
I rudely cut you off, so let me not do that again. I was just saying that I love that concept that Rebecca was talking about. Like that it starts fluidly and it can be read fluidly. I was really excited to hear you read it, Rebecca, because I wanted to know like your approach. I'm also kind of curious, like if your plot holes like emerged in an order that like and like how you decided to space them as you were writing or like choosing where to put each. But I think for me, when I've never written a visual poem that's quite that expansive, Rebecca, and I think yours is done so well. So I'm really interested in hearing you talk about that. For me, I think of like the limitations of language in poetry as kind of what my role as a poet is to provide clarity and truth, and that might not be everybody's role as a poet, but is mine that I feel. And I think in like with everything going on, we can see the way that people will twist language in order to, you know, absolve something like, explosion Gazans say was airstrike is a headline in the New York Times. Like that shouldn't be a thing to me. And you can see how language is limited, but how it also like opens possibilities through what you allow on the page. And I think that's really interesting. And for me, when I write about a poem that considers other languages that I have, it's harder for me because I'm a diaspora baby. I don't speak as fluently as I might like to the languages of my parents, but I consider my role in that then to be as clear as possible. So in those limitations, I think I'm interested in finding like the small spaces that language can provide to things that we, as Rebecca said, like might not have language for in a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I just want to say too, I love this, like, I feel like that, like, active or passive verb and, like, who in power is wielding that is so, like, we're seeing right now how important that is. And, like, in our work, I mean, certainly, like, right, we're not the New York Times, but in terms of reach, but, like, the responsibility in terms of thinking about verb specificity and, like, agency, I feel like, yeah, that's so important.
Yeah, definitely. I think that kind of some of what was said kind of segues into our next question, which is how do you think about form? So I guess the shape of the poem and the way that it appears on the page. So I guess the elements of a poem that are maybe not the words. And do you think about it consciously? Or you like, I'm going to write a poem that is in this form, or does it unfold naturally as you develop the piece?
I will talk first because I think my answer will actually be less exciting for Rebecca's because that's a really formal piece. I think that form to me is a vessel, so it depends how much you're trying to pour into it. Whatever shape your poem is can only fit so much, and sometimes that comes in like pre-made forms like sestina, pantoum, a repetition or a refrain. I think for me, when I write in the prose format, I'm actually thinking of it as an absence of line break, because line break is my go-to as a poet. And when I write in like sentences that span the whole width of a page, I'm more thinking about the experience that I want to create for my reader and how they might have to like pay more attention physically to the paper or the screen or whatever they're reading it on to catch every word. So I think sometimes line breaks give you the option to like, highlight a word at the beginning or end of a line, and you don't really get that with prose. So For this one, in that way, I was thinking about, when I drafted this, it was already in prose, because I was thinking about the ways that like writing about language and how that might fit into like kind of a more, at least looking, essayistic paper than a poem.
Yeah, I love that you said that about prose poems, because obviously this poem that I just read is not, but I have another one in this collection that is a prose poem, and it like took a lot of iterations to get there. And like I think what you said about kind of asking the reader to do a little bit more work in terms of kind of deciding where they'd like to take pauses or what is standing out. And I think especially if we're writing about, I mean, not especially, but for me, when I was writing about like violence and like surveillance and thinking about like troubling those kinds of narratives, every time I was trying to break lines in this particular poem, it like just didn't feel right. And I was like, oh, I feel like I'm kind of like, what's missing here? And then as soon as I put it into a paragraph, I felt like, oh, okay, this is like the shape that it's supposed to be in. So yeah, I think prose poetry and like its relationship to the lyric essay is like very expansive. You could do a lot there. Yeah, and then I don't know, I do a lot of form. I think that's like a way that I get back into writing too. If I'm having a tough time, I feel like put it in a sonnet, right? Like I feel like putting something into a sonnet is such a great way to like look at it differently. And even if you take it right back out of the sonnet, you've like put it in a little box and you can like decide, oh, this vessel is way too small, it's not going to fit in here, this needs to be a sonnet crown. Or you're like, oh, actually, like this should be a sonnet or even smaller. So I think form is related to content often, but it's also really related to like how I can feel excited about getting something onto the page, and like just being okay with the fact that whatever form it's starting in doesn't necessarily dictate how it's going to end up.
Thank you both for those really interesting answers. I I found it really interesting as a prose writer to hear you talk about that. I think of poetry as being kind of inherently like formal. Like I sort of think of fiction as like the way it looks on the page doesn't matter, but poetry is the opposite of that. But that might be a limitation in my thinking. So one thing I was curious about was, I think that there's a presence of the body in both of these pieces that is really vital and um, that's really interesting. And I wonder about how you think about embodiment and writing the body on the page as poets.
Yeah, this is a good question. Um, for people in the audience, what you might not know is we actually got these questions before this talk, but this was one that I just couldn't think of an answer to because it's actually such a good question and I just never thought about it phrased this way. So thank you, Maya, for that. But I think kind of what I ended up landing on is Melissa Phoebos has this essay called In Praise of Navel Gazing, and it goes again, it's like the idea of navel gazing kind of being something that, you know, minimizes the idea of writing about the self, kind of like the same way the patriarchal powers that be created a mode of confessional poetry and tried to shove that to the side as being less valuable. And Melissa Phoebos kind of writes against that. And I think when you're someone of a marginalized body, whether that's race, ethnicity, gender, disability, I think when you're writing about the body, it becomes revolutionary and not navel gazy. And I think that a lot of my writing considers presence, and it's really hard to write about presence without writing about the body because it's hard to not think about what one is physically experiencing, whether that's an emotion, it still comes with a feeling, right? It comes with a physical sensation. So in that way, I think it's kind of always like lurking in the back of my work. And and writing the body becomes about writing the experience. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that you brought up Melissa Febos too, because I just started reading the lyric essay as an act of resistance, so like compiled. And they specifically really talk about in their introduction. I've only read like the first two essays, so like a little fake for me to bring up, but Melissa Febos is in there. But yeah, like thinking about positionality and like, I don't know, right? I am a person in a body who's writing. And so especially now that I'm about a year out of like graduate school, I think, I don't know, like thinking about embodied experience continues to be something that is like both really important, but also it can be a struggle because even my own relationship with like gender and language has shifted since I even wrote this poem that I just read, right? Like I think it's really exciting to think about different ways to think about bodies outside of like English words of like man and woman. Obviously, there's like a lot of expansive possibilities there, but like in certain narratives, like they're hard to find. And so like creating that space can be difficult. But yeah, I think especially for this poem and like this project, I felt like I was so I want to be careful about where I'm like writing my own body and like where I'm speaking and like where I'm like letting someone else speak. And so and when it's your own work, like that's challenging because you ultimately are the one writing it, right? So yeah, maybe also like not a good answer. I this question was so good too, and I was just like, this is like such a big question. Like I feel like I'm just going to be thinking about this every time I'm writing a poem. So maybe next time I'll have a better answer when I write a few more, you know.
Those are both great answers. Switching gears a little, are there writers that you are particularly influenced by? Either for these pieces or I guess in your work in general.
Oh, well, for this piece, I very blatantly was influenced by Lee Young Lee's poem Persimmons, in which he mixes up the word persimmon and the word permission. So I was interested in like language immediately, and funnily, my parents do have a persimmon tree in their backyard. And I just like I didn't think there was a way for me to write about persimmons without even like bringing that poem into it, because it's been so influential in my life. And Lee Young Lee is just a poet that's been really influential to me, period. So for this piece, that was like there was like a really clear lineage. Oh, thank you, Haley, for putting that link in the chat. Yes. Great poem. Everyone should read it.
Oh, I was trying to think back. It's like I mentioned, this poem actually like it feels close to me, but also far in a lot of ways, just in terms of time. But yeah, I think Monica Ong's Silent Anatomies was like a really important kind of like visual inspiration for me. And I think I was reading like Layla Chatty's book as well, has some, and Mary Shebus both have like a lot, definitely more religious focused in those two texts than mine ended up being, but definitely really concerned with like embodied experience too. So I would say those are like the main inspirations at the time that I was writing. But I just read Lillian Yvonne Bertram's book, Negative Money, and I loved that. And also Judas Goat by Gabrielle Bates are two that are like, I feel like are my more current inspirations. But the others are still inspirational, of course.
I feel like I see Judas Goat in this poem, even though you wrote it before Judas Goat. Like I see the parallels, like I see your thinkings. And I just wanted to say, like, yeah, Layla Chatty's Deluge was also huge for me in writing about the body and like religious themes. Like that's a really good collection too that people should check out. So echoing.
Yeah, and her chapbook with I'm like forgetting the other person's
Dorian,
name because
Dorian Locks.
yes, yeah,
Yes.
the mothers, yeah, that one
Yes.
is like fantastic too. So love a collaborative poetry collection.
Awesome. So I'm also curious, what influences you besides other writers? So like art or music or nature or anything else? Where else do you look for inspiration?
I feel like it's such a cliche poet thing, but like really everywhere. I think I wrote a lot in my like collection that I'm allegedly sending the manuscript out. We'll see. I'm working on poets working on the manuscript. But it's very like there's a lot. It's responding to a lot, but even like for me, I don't know, like watching like the Twilight Zone or like sci-fi films ended up being important. That's not like the only thing that I'm doing to write poems, but I do feel like there are a lot of poems that come out of like hearing a weird like line of dialogue or it's like seeing kind of like one specific, I don't know, I feel like most poets have, right? They're like, oh, I saw this leaf and I like had to go home and write about it, and not to be that person, but sometimes that is really how it is. But yeah, I feel like I do watch a lot of TV. I feel like a lot of writers are going to be like, I don't own TV, but I do own a TV, and I've seen a lot of it, and I do write about it. So in addition to books, I feel like even just the kind of like more like banal or non-writerly things that we don't assign literary value to, definitely interest me as like a challenging space to try to make a good poem, and like they're not always good. So
That's so funny. I would agree with that. I think like a lot of stuff, like the everyday, the mundane, etc., does end up inspiring me. Maybe like not in that moment, but I do keep like in my notes app, just the occasional like little overheard line or you know, this is so silly, but I don't know if anyone watched this when it came out, but WandaVision, like the Marvel television show on Disney Plus. There's like a line in the show that goes, "What is grief if not love persevering?" And that line made me watch the whole show. Like I saw people talking about that line and I was like, I need to watch this show. So I think it is like Rebecca said, like sometimes those little like banal things that you might not think of as deeply poetic end up being sources of really, really good inspiration. And totally agree with Asana in the chat, like eavesdropping is huge. I'm very nosy and I love eavesdropping, and I love taking little pieces of overheard dialogue and putting them in a poem. Because sometimes like when you don't know the context, your imagination can go a little wilder, and like it can take you to more interesting spaces than like when you do fully understand the context.
I'm also a big eavesdropper, and I also have the overheard lines Google notes document. It's very important. So, what was the revision process like for these pieces? Do you want to talk about any major changes that they underwent?
I was so interested, Saba, to hear that like yours, I think you said you started out as prose poem too. I think okay, also I was like rediscovering how disorganized my documents are on my computer today, but I was looking back at some drafts because I wanted to think more about this. And I do think that this poem started with like me writing down Beehive's artist system and just like a really unhinged like notes app, right? Not organized at all. And then like forgetting about it. I was doing something for a workshop, come back to it later, and I was thinking about doing something visual and like I added a couple of things. And the first draft of this that I submitted was like kind of looks similar on the page. It has like the holes in the middle and the arrows, but I only had I think 3 or 4 little guys, little plot holes. And I was really didn't like it. I was like, this isn't anything. I think I called it nature's recycling because I was thinking a lot more about how it looks like a scientific kind of like cycle or graph or chart. And I was kind of like, oh, this isn't anything. And I like put it away for a while, and then I don't know, probably a couple months later came back to it and now it is bigger, and I think titles are so important. I used to like get all my students, I was like, you're not allowed to turn anything untitled, because even if it ends up being untitled later, like I feel like it gives you permission to like do something kind of crazy or whatever in the title, and then that can really affect, you know, your own relationship with the poem too. So once I changed the title too, I was like, oh, okay, this is like not what I thought that it was. So yeah, all that's to say, it started out, you know, a little prose in the notes app, and I just messed around with it a little, and I'm not that good at using Microsoft Word, so like it was a journey. But yeah, I think anything you can do to like rearrange things or see something differently is helpful in that process.
You did
I,
this in Microsoft Word?
Yes, but that's like embarrassing, because I think that's not the
No.
best way that I could have done it.
I am so impressed by that. Like, I feel like the reason that I've never written something like this is because I literally can't figure it out on the computer.
Listen, you can just like, you can move things around, you can take screenshots, it can be as low tech as you want it to be.
You've opened up so many possibilities for me just now, Rebecca.
were
Um,
they at least text boxes, or were you literally just hitting enter?
They were not text boxes. They should have been. That would have made so much more sense. What was I doing? I don't know. I probably do text boxes now, but I don't know what I am. So that
You
was
are
a
very
little
patient.
more personal than I even wanted to get, but now you know that I'm really using Microsoft Word in this unhinged way.
you've actually given me so much hope, like that I can physically like space and enter if I need to.
We all can. You can.
For me, when I started writing this poem, for some reason I had it in my brain that well, I was writing a lot of self-portrait poems at the time. So then I was like influenced by this poem by Liang Li, as a Chinese American writer, wanting to like call upon some poetic lineage. But what I ended up trying at first was I had 3 sections with like 3 stanzas. I putting that in quote because it's prose, but like three separated sections like with the asterisks, and then each section having 3 like separate little thoughts or stanzas. And my revision process was just like cutting out all the bad stuff that I wrote, really. I'm like being okay with the idea that it wasn't going to be in exactly the shape that I wanted it to be, because part of me was like, oh, I'll do 3 to represent 1 for each language and then 3 in each box, and that'll be like a whole thing. And basically it didn't really need that. Like I was just adding a lot of extra stuff to make it fill this preconceived notion that I had. And I think that's something that's like very interesting about the revision process, is it forces you to think about like what's actually necessary, and then it makes you think harder about what placing things next to each other does. And part of that means like trusting your reader or trusting your audience to be able to figure these things out without it explicitly stated or spelled out, even that if that's via the form. Like I didn't need to like hammer that point in so hard, it felt like. So for me, it started out a lot longer and ended up, just trimming all the stuff that I didn't like.
Now, I love what you said about like wanting it to be in like 3 sections to represent this thing. Like I feel like that's poet math. We're always like, oh, well, it's gonna be in like these sections and it's gonna perfectly represent everything I want to say. And then you're like, oh, but actually this is wrong.
Oh yeah, poet math is the new girl math. I love that.
Yeah. Sorry, Maya. I feel like you have I won't talk over you anymore with my poet math jokes. But actually serious, I do think we should be thinking about poet math more.
I agree.
Um, or is there any poet math in your piece?
I mean, I think yeah, right? Like it's like I don't know. In this one, I do feel like less than others, because there's other forms like, right, like the sonnet that are really like, oh, you have like X number of pieces, and I was kind of, right, I created the plot hole form, but yeah, I think I was like, oh, I have, right, X is a system, stanzas, and I have, if I wanted to tell you stanzas and I wanted to balance them out on the page. And so originally I did think it was like, oh, I have to have them all be like an equal length, and there has to be an equal number of both, and they have to do this and this, and right, like it didn't end up exactly that way because, and that ended up being fine too, right? Because it was more fluid than I was hoping it would be. Kind of got away from me, but I think that's the nature of it.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. If anyone else wants to ask a question, please drop it in the Q&A section of the chat. One of them really goes along with what Saba was just saying. It's from Claudia Owusu. I'm so sorry if I messed up your name. In working with the theme of architecture, how do you know what to keep in and what to take out?
I like the framing of it as architecture. I think Christina's still here, so I'll just do a shout out to Christina. Like, what a good theme, what a good issue call. Mwah. Architecture. So if we think of like what a load bearing wall is versus like something else. So I think when I'm deciding what to keep and what to take out, like I can't take out a load bearing wall because then the entire poem building will just collapse. But you can take out frills, like you can have some of them. And I think it's actually really interesting because there are different styles in poetry. Like you can go full out maximalist. You can add in all sorts of flourishes, and that's totally valuable and a style that works for people. I think for me, like going back to my main role, my main goal always being like clarity. Like I think I keep the load bearing walls, and then the rest of it is like, yeah, sometimes you put paint, to make it look nice, to make it sound good. But like in terms of what is like ultimately what I will keep, it is those load bearing walls, and I don't feel like anything else is necessary in my process of revision.
Wow, I'm like, feel like I'm having such a moment. I love load bearing walls, thinking about that in a poem. Like, I'm going to be thinking about that every time I'm revising too. I think I used to always ask my students, like, could this title do more heavy lifting? And they would like laugh at me about that. But this is like, I'm bringing this into. Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't have phrased it that way, but now I will, forever. But I think, yeah, I mean, for me, I would say it's really different with every poem. And like, I do think as poets, we're always thinking about our work in relationship. So in relationship to, right, if we're putting a collection together, we're thinking about what's on either side of it. Even if we're just sending poems out individually, the order is important. And even if we're just kind of us in the page, we're thinking about the relationship between us and other people who are writing. And so I think that relationship, especially, I don't think it should be like the only thing you're thinking about when you're revising. And if you let it be too loud, like that can sometimes be a hindrance. But for me, I think, especially later revisions where I'm like thinking about a final version, I think that relationship and like the conversation that's happening, but that's still allowing the load bearing parts of the poem to shine through is like very key.
Yeah, I think we'll all be using that terminology from now on. So thank you, Saba. So we have this is an anonymous question. Does the actual structure or architecture of poem come first when you're writing or drafting, or do the words come first? So I think you've both addressed this a little bit. Is there anything else that you want to say about that? How you approach the structure and architecture of your poems?
I think it's happened for me both ways. I've definitely set out to be like, I'm gonna write a sestina, and then I'll just choose 6 words out of a book and try to make up something with that. But usually that is not like the most organic way for me to be generative. That's like when I'm trying to trick myself into writing, when it's like, we haven't written in a bit. Like maybe we should get that going. And I think in that way, like form actually becomes a really useful way to like play with poetry when you're using it as like the starting point. Um most of the time, yeah, it starts with the words. It starts with how it sounds to me in my ear before I put it on the page. And that's kind of why I have my notes app. Like I hear something that I like, and then I'm like, okay, like let me ruminate on that. Let it marinate for a bit before I decide what it's going to be. And then it kind of just like, floats around in the brain and the empty head, like in the ether of my mind. And when it like starts ringing, that's when I'll be like, okay, time to put it down, time to figure out what vessel it goes into. So yeah, usually the words come first.
Yeah, I would say same. Every once in a while. I do think this one, I guess, kind of started in its form and stays that way, which is a little bit unusual, but most of the time it's like notes app or paragraph or things that I've like kind of just jammed together, and then gotta let them marinate, gotta let them take their time. And then form is a great way to either break into something that I'm like, I don't know what to do with all these words, or to trick myself into writing another classic. But yeah, I think generally the words are first, other than every once in a while, I don't know, I guess there's like a sonnet that's like, I have to be a sonnet immediately, but that's not very common. So
We have a final audience question. What poets are you currently reading?
Yeah, I have been reading, well, I've been trying to like do my due diligence. I've been reading a lot of Palestinian poets these days. Top of the list would be Hala Alian, and I'll type her name in the chat. She has two or three poetry collections, one coming out next year, and she also has 2 novels. So if poetry isn't like your go-to genre, she has 2 amazing novels. And I'm always very jealous of poets that can write novels because I don't think I'm one of them. So that's like prose that I'm drawn to usually. So she's been at the top of the list. And I recently picked up a book that I'm very excited to read. And the reason that I'm stalling is because I can't remember who wrote it, but it is called Rose Quartz. I just picked it up when I was in Minneapolis at Milkweed because it's a Milkweed book. And I believe it's like an Indigenous writer, and I'm just really excited to read that. So I'll plug that for folks as well.
that's on my to read list too. I have been not reading a ton the last month. I've been like traveling for my day job a lot. But I just started reading like the lyric essay as Resistance. So that's like a collected anthology. I think Erica Traywold and Zoe Bossier. I haven't heard them say their name out loud, so I'm not sure pronunciation, but are the editors for that. And it has like mostly Phoebos, Alyssa Washuta, a ton of other like, I feel like heavy hitters in the creative nonfiction genre. But I think I mentioned too, Judascope by Gabrielle Bates, I feel like has been my fave poetry book of the year that I've read so far. But I have Oculus by Sally Wen Mao, I believe. It's like on my nightstand now, and that's like the next poetry book that I'm starting. So super excited about that one.
I think we have time for one more quick question. So as people, like I think some of the people here, including myself, are in MFA programs or considering them. Is receiving feedback from writers an important part of your process? And if you do, and if it is, how do you seek out that feedback, and how has that changed from when you were part of a creative writing program? Because I read in both of your bios that you have graduated from those programs.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm still figuring out what that looks like post MFA, because that is such a specific kind of space that you get to have really focused attention on your work, especially with like your thesis advisors later on in the process who are like basically scholars of your work, right? They're like really close reading, which is so cool. But I mean, I would say it's very important, and I think uh definitely during the MFA process, obviously that's like a big emphasis on like is placed on like workshopping and reading each other's work. But I don't know, I think like post that it's about finding like your community, and you can connect with people through like events like these, or seeing, I don't know, who else is being published in the same journals as you, and like who's currently writing that you're like interested in. And not necessarily that you should like DM every random poet that you like their work, but I like think what I said earlier too about thinking about yourself in conversation is super important. So even if you're not like, oh, hey Saba, your poems are cool, will you read and give me feedback? Right? You can be like, oh, how is my work in conversation with this? Or like, how, what is this person doing that is like really awesome and fantastic? Or like, could I emulate elements of this form? How is this different from what I'm doing? So I think like the way that feedback comes is certainly different after MFA, because you're just not going to have the same like time and attention, because everybody is like working and doing other things too. But at least having like a few friends that are close readers can definitely be like useful, especially if you're putting together like a longer project.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think when people are reading your work every week in the MFA, it's a totally different experience when you leave. But my like key advice for someone who's in an MFA program is like try to make at least one bestie that you can like text even if you have a quick question about a poem, because that feedback is even like so valuable. And it's also, it makes you have a different relationship with your work, because like Rebecca said, everyone's busy, everyone has a job, like everyone's really tired, and you don't want to just ask someone to give you like free labor. But when you can pinpoint something that you feel isn't working in a poem, and you can articulate why you feel that way and come up with like a concrete question about it, and you can fire that off to a trusted friend, that's really valuable, both to have that friend's feedback, but also because it forces you to like really hone in on your poem and like be that first reader for yourself, which is really hard to do and like something you have to work at and learn at. But I do think like being out of the MFA program gives you that opportunity. So like kind of embrace that, even though it is very scary to graduate.
Thank you both so much. That's all the time we have for questions today. So I'm going to hand it over to Frankie to wrap us up.
Hey guys, it's me again, Frankie. Thank you again so much to Saba and Rebecca for sharing your work with us, and sharing all these wonderful insights with us. We really, really appreciated you guys taking the time to speak with us today. Um, Thank you, Maya, for facilitating the event, Susan for organizing the event, and thank you, Isa, for keeping vigilant in the chat, and making sure that everything is going smoothly. And most of all, thank you to you, the audience, for attending. We're so happy that you could join us again. Just a couple quick things before we wrap up tonight. A recording of this event will be up on the HFR site soon. So if there's anything that you missed, or you want to review some things that our lovely readers said, then you'll be able to view it again on the HFR site. You will also receive a brief survey to offer feedback on the experience. Thank you in advance for filling it out. And you can stay in touch with Hayden's Ferry Review by signing up for our newsletter, which Isa should be throwing into the chat now. So thank you again. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon. Bye.